Lorenzo, so how do you explain the fact that the U.S. recently is becoming, certain fertile ground for the spread of homegrown terror and the appearance of lone wolves?
Well, I think we have, like in all countries, in Europe, for example, we have individuals who are undergoing the radicalization process. Here in the States, exactly like everywhere else. I think the difference here is that these individuals who radicalize mostly independently in small groups with a lot of internet use, they are not necessarily part of recruitment pipelines. It's much more difficult to go to Syria, to go to Iraq and join ISIS if you live in the States compared to Europe, for example. So there's not sort of that alley, that the direction that takes them there. So they have to, in a way, act, but when they want to mobilize, it's easier for them to do it in the United States rather than connect with other people and connect with groups and travel to Syria and Iraq. If you add to that the easy access to automatic weapons, which is obviously something very American, which doesn't really exist in Europe, you have this combination where you have individuals that act independently and have access to guns, and they can carry out very not sophisticated, but at times very tragic events like Orlando or San Bernardino.
And that was my next question. You just mentioned permissive legislation on gun ownership in the United States. Do you feel that changing this legislation or amending it will help fighting the threat of homegrown terror in the country?
Well, it's obviously a very politically charged debate when it comes to gun rights, and it's something that has been one of the priorities of the Obama administration, with obviously a lot of pushback from different quarters. It's undeniable, though, that individuals who are radicalized and in many cases known to the FBI as radicalized nonetheless have a legal access to very sophisticated weapons in many cases, and that undeniably is problematic. I think it's one of the differences that we see in Europe, where it's sometimes difficult, although not impossible through the black market, but it's much more difficult in Europe for individuals who are radicalized to get access to sophisticated weapons. So you see these kind of lone wolves attacks in Europe, but they use knives or small guns. So very different level of sophistication compared to the automatic weapons which are used in Orlando or in San Bernardino.
So if we try to deconstruct what happened in Orlando recently, where do you think the major failures were? FBI, or just in general the situation was such that it wasn't possible to identify, detect, and prevent that?
Well, it's very difficult to give an answer now because we don't know all the facts of the case. And I think we're going to learn more over the next few weeks and months. It's obvious that this was somebody that was known to the FBI, and this is a dynamic that we have seen with all previous attacks. Again, San Bernardino, Garland, even Chattanooga. This was somebody that was known, but being known is a completely different thing from being somebody that can be arrested. You know, there's limitations in what the FBI can do with people who are clearly radicalized, clearly espousing an extremist ideology, but have not engaged in any criminal behavior. They are in this pre-criminal space. So the FBI can interview them, can talk to them, can to some degree monitor them, but again, the resources are limited. They cannot keep tabs and monitor 24/7 every individual that occasionally espouses radical views. So they have to allocate resources in a certain way, and obviously this individual was not considered to be a top priority. And it's easy today to do sort of Monday morning quarterbacking and say that it was a mistake, but it's a very difficult call to make. The system is what it is. I think unless you really violate civil liberties, being a radical is not a crime, and it shouldn't be. It's First Amendment protected behavior. Obviously, it might warrant some monitoring, but again, the legal and resources limitations that existed to what the FBI can do are there, and I think in a democratic society, at the end of the day, there's not that much that can be done. And I think it's inevitable that some of these dynamics will always be there.
And what is the process of self-radicalization? Can you talk to me about the steps the steps that people take to become self-radicalized?
Well, every case is different. We see that radicalization is a very individualized process. The internet plays a huge role, it's undeniable. Social media has changed the way people radicalize. People can interact with like-minded individuals all over the world, can even talk to people who are fighting in Syria right now, and you can have a conversation with them. That is such a high radicalizing power. But I don't think we should overemphasize the importance of the internet, because a lot of radicalization takes place also offline. So it's often a combination of online and offline. People talk to like-minded individuals with friends. It's often, again, with exceptions, we do have cases of quintessential lone actors that never interacted with anybody who's like-minded in the physical space. But in many cases, we do see that people interact with a small group of people in their town, in their milieu, who are like-minded. Not the big numbers that we see in Europe, but 2, 3, 4 friends, small clusters of people that exist also in the United States. So there is that radicalization in the physical space, a couple of mosques, mostly study groups, or just groups of friends that come together, watch videos, and just egg each other on, and basically there's this process of mutual radicalization. At the same time, everybody is also online, so the offline complements the online and vice versa.
So ISIS seems to be utilizing online tools and social media very successfully. Are there any ways to prevent that, to create a shield that would prevent the message of ISIS being spread across the internet?
ISIS has been very good at exploiting the new technologies. It produces a lot of very good material. It has a big impact. It's very effective, and it has a very good dissemination model, which is really amplified by people who are independent disseminators of propaganda. Vast majority of propaganda doesn't come to you from ISIS directly, but from sympathizers who take it upon, who have no affiliation whatsoever with ISIS formally, but just take it upon themselves to set up Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, and propagate, disseminate this propaganda. So in reality, it's not just ISIS itself, it's always individuals around it. It's very well packaged message, it's very individualized. We also see this new dynamic of individuals targeting specific individuals that they consider to be potentially sympathetic to the message, vulnerable. It's a process that in many cases reminds us of grooming, what sex predators do online, where they see a potential target, somebody that they think can be influenced by their message, and they have this process, and it's quite effective in many cases with young people.
And Lorenzo, how do you explain the fact that ISIS actually claimed responsibility for what happened in Orlando, despite the fact that there was no real formal connection established with the shooter, and he was not known to be getting any instructions or formal training from ISIS?
Yeah, it's likely that ISIS had absolutely no idea about who this guy was. That's been a common pattern. We have seen ISIS, of course, taking credit for attacks in which they do have a strong hand in, like Paris and Brussels. But even in cases like this, and the same goes for San Bernardino, for example, ISIS has no problem claiming responsibility for. In one of the latest issues of The Beak, its official magazine, they claim responsibility for a variety of acts which have been carried out by quintessential lone wolves. In many cases, people who actually are more motivated by psychological and mental issues rather than really a strong belief in ISIS ideology. But from ISIS point of view, that's part of a strategy. It's basically anybody can be ISIS. Anybody, even if it's somebody that is mostly mentally disturbed, takes the mantle of ISIS that amplifies ISIS reach. And it's a strategy that they have embraced, and it's to some degree paying off.
From what I understand, there is this new phenomenon that no formalized ideology is even necessary for different people in different countries to unite under this, one idea, one flag, and operate together. Is it recent? Is it becoming more popular? And how do you explain this?
No, this is not a really recent phenomenon. You had jihadist theorists already in the early 2000s. There was a very famous intellectual, call it like that, of the jihadist movement, a Syrian man called Abu Musab al-Suri, which already around 2000, 2001 theorized that groups did not matter, but it was just the ideology. The only glue that one needed was this common ideology, and people all over the world knew what the message was, knew what the goal were, and knew what the targets were, and simply they could independently, as one global informal movement, carry out attacks. This is somebody that argued that Al-Qaeda, and we're still talking about the Al-Qaeda days, was superfluous. That Al-Qaeda was good in a way in having united and having made global the message of jihad, but should eventually disband. And once the message had gone global, and I think to the internet it has gone global, groups were just a cumbersome thing that needed to disappear. ISIS has been very good at adopting that message, has been very good at using social media to disperse the message, and we're seeing the fruits of this.
When you talk about Europe, you mentioned divided intelligence effort on this issue, contributing to the fact that all these people can get their message from wherever they get it from and then carry out the attacks. Do you think there is a similar problem in the United States, divided intelligence effort, or it's just completely different with kind of, divided agencies here rather than missed opportunities for communication and intelligence?
It's less of a problem in the States, obviously. There are some issues, obviously, in terms of communication between FBI, CIA, and different agencies, although they have gotten so much better over the last few years compared to a pre-9/11 setting where that wall was one of the main reasons why Al-Qaeda was successful to carry out the 9/11 attacks. Europe has this big problem of having borders that still exist when it comes to intelligence agencies. Despite all the developments that have taken place in Europe, I think it's still very much divided. You have in every country the normal internal divides among the different intelligence agencies in each country, to which you have to add the transnational issues that exist among EU countries. In the States, there's less of a problem. Even in the jurisdictional divisions that exist between state, local, and federal, the presence of the joint terrorism task forces really helps in bridging that gap that exists. So the US is very lucky from that point of view.
In 2009, you wrote a piece titled "Keeping a Lid on Homegrown Terror." That was 7 years ago. So based on the analysis of the latest events, do you feel that the United States are kind of failing to do that?
I think we have seen an explosion of cases. Again, it's all relative. The numbers are still very low in the States compared to other countries. But by relative standards, I think we have seen an explosion of numbers here in the States of homegrown cases. This is what the FBI is saying. I'm not sure I can blame the US for that. I think this is a global phenomenon that we have seen. What happened with Syria, with the conflict in Syria, the declaration of the caliphate, the rise to prominence of ISIS has triggered this phenomenon worldwide, and the States is no different from any other country. The problem is not so much from a law enforcement point of view, where I think the FBI has been doing a very good job. It's on the big picture, on the tackling the ideology, tackling the appeal of the ideology. And again, the US, like most other countries, have failed in trying to tackle it.
And do you feel there are any recipes for successfully trying to tackle this issue in Europe and in the United States? And are the recipes different from for two sides of the Atlantic?
Well, I think from a law enforcement point of view, Europeans have to get better in terms of devoting more resources. I think the problem in especially the small countries like Belgium, which obviously has been in the news quite a bit, is the fact that they have not devoted the appropriate resources to tackle with the problem. There's some legal gaps in some European countries that do not have the appropriate legislation. I think the US, from those 2 points of view, the US is in much better shape. When it comes to tackling the ideology, I think the US is at the same problem the Europeans have, trying to find the right balance between understanding whether radicalization is caused by lack of integration, if it's a theological matter, if it's a psychological matter of individuals that have personal issues. I think it's obviously a combination of all these factors. But the bottom line is that ISIS message resonates with a relatively large number of people, and that doesn't seem to be something governments are able to stop.
Do you expect anything from the new president, whoever it is, in the United States in terms of increased effort and increased allocation of resources to tackle these issues?
very difficult to say what's going to happen over the next few months. Obviously, we have two candidates that have very different approaches when it comes to the issue, although one thing is the campaign and what is said during a campaign, and one thing is what happens once they get elected and what they're actually going to do. Obviously, there's a much more aggressive approach from one candidate and a softer, more in line with the Obama approach from Ms. Clinton. So what exactly is going to happen, whether it's going to be a sea change, as Trump to some degree promises, or basically a continuation of what has been the policy of the last few years from Clinton, I think that's what we're going to see.